Till now, we have discussed the various consequences of the First World War, or all the results that came out after the First World War ended. Now, in the last lecture, we had briefly discussed about the formation of a League of Nations. The League of Nations was an international organization that was proposed at the end of the First World War that was to ensure world peace and to promote international cooperation. It is surprising to state that a war that shook the entire world and led to countless deaths eventually led to the formation of an international organization tasked with the purpose of maintaining peace. That is because the world had learned its lesson. If the countries do not work together, they will eventually find themselves on the other side of the battlefield. That is where the concept of the League of Nations emerged. The League of Nations and its formation is often considered to be one of the most important consequences of the First World War. But the concept of the League of Nations, much like any other post-First World War reconstruction ideals, came out of President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. What are these 14 points? President Woodrow Wilson of United States of America, after the First World War, gave out his 14-point proposal, which gave a step-by-step manner of how peace can be achieved and how stability can also be ensured in the post-war period. Now that is where President Woodrow Wilson came up with the concept of a League of Nations. Let us now look at this 14-point declaration. Now, can you answer this question? Who proposed the formation of the League of Nations? Was it Warren D. Harding? Was it Woodrow Wilson? Was it Herbert Hoover? Or was it Franklin Roosevelt? The correct answer would be Woodrow Wilson. Let us then start discussing Wilson's 14 points one by one. Starting off with open diplomacy without secret treaties. We remember how secret diplomacy was an issue during the First World War and how it bred skepticism and suspicion among nations. Wilson proposed that any diplomacy that takes place after the war would be open. It would not be secretive, and the public and the press would have information about any treaties signed during these diplomatic agreements and meetings. Then, economic free trade on the seas during war and peace. Trade is one of the biggest collaterals of war. Trade takes the worst hit when a war breaks out. Trade can also be taken hostage during war. Often, conflicts and wars break out regarding control over trade and monopolies. Therefore, Wilson proposed that in the post-war period, trade would be free for all nations to join, and this particular freedom of trade, this economic freedom, would continue whether it is wartime or peacetime. Trade, especially through the seas, would continue without any hassles. Continuing on the point of trade, Wilson's third point gave a declaration of equal trade conditions, which stated that no country should have exclusive monopoly over certain trading segments and all countries should have access to the same trade links. No country could come up and block out strategic portions of the world which could disrupt international trade. Next is the decrease of armaments among all nations, which makes up the fourth point of Wilson's declaration. Now you remember how the increase of armaments was an issue during the First World War, and the armament race itself being one of the major causes of the First World War to break out. Therefore, Wilson proposed that national armament or the armament of each nation should be drawn to a record low, as low as possible as it might be required to maintain the national security. Moving on, Wilson put forward a proposal to adjust colonial claims amicably. As you remember, the race for colonies also was a cause of the First World War, and therefore Wilson proposed that any colonial claims that might come up between different nations should be put up in front of an organization or an international body, and it must be dealt with in a judicious manner and should not require war or conflict. The next point or the next proposal was more region-centric. If you remember, during the course of war, Russia had to exit the First World War as a revolution took place in Russia where a regime change took place. Now, when Russia was exiting the war, it signed many unequal treaties with the Central Powers. The Central Powers were able to gain strategic territories of Russia. When the war ended, Wilson proposed that all Central Powers must evacuate or leave Russia, and Russia should have its own authority to define its own independence. Any other nation should not be involved in Russian independence or Russian future. Then coming to the clause of Belgium, which was occupied by Germany in its attempt to occupy France, must also be evacuated and its independence restored, said the 14-point proposal. Now, if you remember, the region of Alsace-Lorraine was a disputed territory between France and Germany. Now, Germany had occupied Alsace-Lorraine during the Franco-Prussian War, which was a humiliating defeat for France. When the Allied nations, of which France was a part, won the First World War, it wanted this particular French territory back, and therefore, the Wilson's 14 points also propose a return of Alsace-Lorraine region from Germany to France, and even similar French territories must also be returned, said the proposal. Italy as a nation had first joined the war on the side of the Central Powers, where it remained neutral. But during the course of war, Italy had shifted sides and joined the Allies. When the Allied nations won, Italy also won the war, and therefore Italy needed some territorial gains. That is why Wilson's 14 points also put forward a claim for a readjustment of Italian borders where Italy can incorporate more territories into its domain. Now, Austria-Hungary, a central power which had been defeated in the war, was considered to be very important for Wilson. Wilson considered that Austria-Hungary is very crucial for the stability of Central Europe, and therefore he proposed that Austria-Hungary must be provided an opportunity for self-determination or forming its own government, and if required, they can even form two governments and even lead to the splitting of the nation. We remember how volatile and unstable the Balkan regions were during the First World War, and how the Balkan regions provided the very impetus for the First World War to break out. Therefore, the Balkan regions needed to be stabilized after the First World War. And Wilson proposed that for this to happen, the Balkan regions need territorial rearrangements, which means that the borders of all the Balkan nations, namely Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, and other nations, must be redrawn so all the territorial claims made by these nations could be fulfilled and peace and stability could be achieved. Wilson's 14 points also proposed the creation of a free Turkish state, as Turkish nationalism and the war of Turkish independence was looming. Wilson also felt that Turkey as a modern nation or as an emerging nation should also be given free trade in the Dardanelles Strait, which is a region or a water body next to Turkey which is very important for it for trade. Therefore, Turkey was to be given the opportunity to be free and independent. On the lines of nations becoming independent, a similar provision was given for the independence or the creation of an independent Polish state. Poland, a nation that was being created out of Germany. And last but not the least, and perhaps the most important, was that Wilson proposed the creation of the League of Nations, an organization which brings the world together, it promotes international cooperation, and it fosters world peace. An organization which binds all its members to not resort to war, but perhaps come together and by arbitration settle disputes. And an organization where each member state also respects the territorial integrity and independence of the other. In essence, an organization which would create and maintain world peace. Now that we understood from what ideals the League of Nations was birthed out of, let's now look at the formation of the League of Nations itself. So the League of Nations was set up by the Allies or the countries that won the war, and it was for the purpose of settling international disputes, as we already have mentioned. Now, apart from settling international disputes, it also had the very crucial task of maintenance of peace among nations, and that can only be done when nations have dialogue and nations can discuss things among them, which the League of Nations would present a platform for. And this particular organization, therefore, was to be called the League of Nations. Now, as already mentioned, the formation of the League of Nations was based on Wilson's 14 points. And to settle the very core principles of the League of Nations, a covenant was proposed. A covenant is a code document which settles in all the rules and all the particular principles of an organization. And this particular covenant, which contained the rules and functions of the League, was to be drafted by the Allied powers. And finally, this covenant would also include the agreement itself, which when signed would bind all the member nations to refrain from war. Now, if you remember on our discussions of the peace settlements, the covenant was made as a compulsory addition to all the peace treaties. And if you also look back at the peace settlement, you will see how many of Wilson's 14 points made their way into the various peace treaties. This is because Wilson's 14 points presented an idea of a post-war Europe and a post-war world, for a matter of fact, and that was used as an ideological inspiration. Now, finally, the League of Nations had its birth on 10 January 1920, when its charter or its covenant was added to the Treaty of Versailles. And when all the nations signed this particular treaty, the League of Nations as an organization came into existence. Upon its creation, the League of Nations found its physical manifestation when its headquarters was placed at Geneva, Switzerland. Now let us look briefly at the various aims and objectives of the League of Nations. First is to achieve international peace and security. International peace is achieved when nations come together and pledge to not resort to war. International security is achieved when nations respect each other's territorial sovereignty and integrities, which the League was to maintain. Then, the League was to promote international cooperation or dialogue between nations. Secret diplomacy no longer had any place in the modern world, and this cooperation would be based on an open and inclusive diplomatic model where all nations will come together and will propose to make a better world. The League of Nations also planned to rapidly disarm all nations, or to limit the national armament of a nation to a very, very low level, enough to simply maintain national security, but not enough to go to war, as war should not be required anymore. The League of Nations was to also preserve the territorial integrity and political independence of all members. There is no peace if all are not equal. That was the principle which League of Nations believed in, and the League also felt that it should preserve the territorial integrity of a nation or its own boundaries and its own borders, and only then will a nation feel safe and feel free to cooperate with other nations. And that is why it was the League's objective to maintain the independence and territorial integrity of all its member nations. The League also was to analyze and reconsider any existing treaties which could have caused a threat to peace itself. The League also had the very lofty objective of promoting human welfare, as human life as an asset had degraded rapidly during the First World War, where we have seen countless human rights violations. Therefore, human welfare itself was to be promoted by the League of Nations. The League also had the task of promoting socio-economic and cultural cooperation among the member nations, as social equality and cultural cooperation would allow no ethnic clashes to take place and would also stop any sentiments like aggressive nationalism to take its power on nations. Also, economic cooperation would lead to a free and equal understanding of the world economy and free trade policies. Finally, any form of secret diplomacy was frowned upon. Diplomacy, moving from this point forward, was to be open, inclusive, and also cooperative, involving all nations to come together and to work for a higher purpose than just national interest. for the smooth functioning of the League of Nations, the League itself delegated its many responsibilities among its many organs. Now, as a human body has many organs which we require for a smooth functioning of our processes, the League also delegated its tasks to its various organs. First, we have the General Assembly, where all the member nations would come together and discuss and debate any issue which concerned the entire world and concerned world peace in general. Next, we had the Council. The Council included all the member nations that won the First World War, namely the Allied nations. The Council had the task of making or taking important decisions and passing crucial resolutions. So it was the real working body of the League. Then we had the Secretariat. This was the executive wing of the League, which was essential for the smooth functioning of all the other organs as it provided the administrative base for them to function upon. Then we had the Court of International Justice, which works like a world court, where nations could bring forward their disputes, primarily border disputes with other nations, and then it would be settled and arbitrated on international law. And finally, there was the International Labour Office, which was to promote socio-economic equality and to also provide international norms and standards of labour. Therefore, in this lecture, we saw the formation of the League of Nations itself, the very high ideals of Wilson's 14 points from where it found its inception, and we also saw the aims, the objectives, the various functions of the League of Nations, and finally the various organs of the League of Nations through which it carried out its tasks. The League of Nations was a success in its initial years. An organization of its scale was never imagined in history. That is because the global conflict of the First World War never took place in the world, which really would urge the world to think of its existence. Well, the League proved to be a success in the initial period, solving many global conflicts. Eventually, it was set on a path of failure. In the next lecture, we would be properly focusing on what were the various reasons why the League failed in its purpose. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it is rewarding too. So register for free now.